So can we, I have a few other questions about this, but maybe could we just quickly run through like the basics of their care, just like a skeleton version of,
Yeah.
I'm sure there's some species diversity there as well, but maybe just a kind of 10,000 foot view there.
So that's the great thing is there's pretty minimal differences across the species board. There are a few that are a little bit less sensitive to, or more sensitive to heat fluctuation, and then some size difference for like caging purposes. But pretty much you're talking, we usually recommend screen cages. Some people do all glass cages. It's not something we recommend. It can be done. I've seen it be successful before, but the big thing is they need a lot of airflow. They live in high humidity environments. And if that air is stagnant, it's much more likely that they'll get upper respiratory infections, which can be completely detrimental to them. So kind of behind me is a good example of setup. These are 16-16-30 Reptibreeze by ZoomEd. Some people use the 18-18-36. I just like the 16-16-30s. I think they're a good size. Usually I keep my males and females separate, except for when they're breeding. However, I may be changing that strategy, and we can talk a little bit more about some of that and how we've been collecting data from the whole community. But we might be gearing towards leaving them together year round. Just depends on what works. But usually we use sphagnum moss as a substrate. That provides a really good layer that the animals can get down into to cool down if their ambient temperature is too high. They are more cold tolerant species than heat tolerant. So you got to kind of change your thinking from typical reptiles where you want to give them a bunch of heat. These guys really shouldn't get over 75. 80 is really getting into a dangerous area for ambient. Now, we talk about microclimates a lot. Having a large thermal gradient in your cage, occasionally the top of my cages, some of the basking spots will be well up into the 90, but it's also the size of $50, just because I have really focused little pucklates providing that heat source. So if the female wants to go to bask and kind of help cook the babies, so to speak, she can do so. But then the cage at the bottom is staying well below like 65, usually down into like 60 degree.
So you must just keep the whole basement cold then.
Yeah, so basements are great because it's naturally a little bit cooler. So here the ambient runs at around like 64 to 68, depending on the season. And then we'll put UVB lights. So they definitely need UVB. And we actually offer pretty high levels of UVB. So I use mostly the 12% Arcadias on adults, the T5s. In cloud forests, even though they are a canopy dwelling species, they're higher up in elevation. So we're probably getting a lot more UV exposure. And I've actually seen some good aspects of kind of changing back to more of that wild coloration with proper supplementation and then really high UV exposure. Now, I also make sure you can kind of see the cages at the bottom are pretty dark as well. I try and give them a spot where they can get away from that UV, get away from the heat, but oftentimes they actually choose to sit up in the Spanish moss or sit out under the light. But they really do need to be able to stay cool if they feel like they're overheating. I personally like to use a lot of live plants. It's not necessary. I think it just looks nice and naturalistic. A lot of people say not to use bromeliads because there is an aspect of as they defecate, crickets die in the bromeliads, it can create a kind of nasty stagnant water. So I try to go through and flush my bromeliads to make sure that there's not stagnant, nasty water sitting in them. But because of that, I am also switching more to your Tillandsias, which are honestly something they seem to utilize even more, because when the Tillandsias start to die, those little dead fronds and stuff create these little pockets that they can hang out in, where they can bask, soak up UV, but still feel nice and tight and secure like they would in the wild. Spanish moss is another great thing. They love to hide under that. Even just hanging on a wall behind Spanish moss, they usually feel really comfortable there. And then just lots of branches for them to climb around on. It's important that they can utilize all the different spaces of their cage, whether it's climbing up and down or even digging down below the substrate to get away from that heat.
And then so you said you're using little pucks for the heat. Is that just like an under the counter type light?
Yep. So just the little halogen puck lights. I put those mostly on my female cages, and then those turn on for basically breeding season, or not breeding season, but producing season. So as gravid females are getting closer to popping out babies, because these are live bearing lizard species, I'll offer that additional heat source. And then they do get a bit of heat from the UV light as well. As they get pretty close to the top, they can get some of that. Not a ton. And then on these, I have just an LED floodlight, more for just plant growth and light, just because the aesthetics on it look nice. But you really don't need much heat at all, if any. It's really not super necessary unless you have a really cold area that you're going to put them in. The other big thing is humidity, but I like to say more hydration. The humidity down here is roughly about 70 to 80% most of the time, because these are screen cages and I have a misting system running, depending on the seasonality, 1 to 5 times a day. Sometimes up to 7 total minutes throughout a day if we're in the high rainy season or simulated rainy season, and then sometimes just once a day. The misting is good for humidity, but these animals very rarely will drink from a water dish. I've started offering water dishes to them just as a absolute backup. If they can't find water or can't collect those droplets, they can go to that water dish and get that hydration that they need. But most of it is going to be licking droplets off of leaves, the screen, wood, any of that, even their own scales. That's typically how they get a lot of that hydration that they need.
How are you maintaining such a high humidity in the basement? Do you have just a giant humidifier running, or?
Nope, it just naturally is somewhat humid down here.
Wow.
The misting definitely helps. I also have way too many cages in here, so it is a lot of misting. I go through about, I think it's close to about 30 gallons of water. No, that can't be right. Maybe between all the cages, probably about 20 to 30 gallons of water in about a week.
Wow.
So there is a good bit of misting that goes into it. And then obviously the sphagnum will soak up a lot of that hydration and really hold on to it, which I think helps with the humidity. I also do run small humidifiers. They're more for aesthetics, but we can kick those on in the cages. And
I know Forrest used to run foggers quite often.
Yeah, I like the foggers. They work out nice, but it's hard to find the right foggers that can do multiple cages without having to buy a specific unit for each cage, especially when you have a bunch. But I don't know how well it'll pick it up, but you can see it kind of runs in from the top. And then usually what I'll do is I'll throw the mist cycle on like first thing in the morning, and then it fogs for 20 minutes or so, just to kind of help bump that ambient humidity up, kind of simulating that dewy cloud forest kind of habitat that they would experience in the wild.
Yeah, I do something very similar with my day gecko as well. And what about diet?
Yeah, so diet, they're pretty much specifically insectivores. So most of mine eat a variety of mostly crickets, but I will offer dubia roaches, waxworms occasionally. That's usually if like a female's just given birth, just to kind of help get some fat back on her. Well gut-loaded crickets. Occasionally, I've tried a few other things. Butterflies is apparently something that they absolutely love. Never would have guessed it, but I had somebody drop off some butterflies that had some messed up wings and tried it out, and they went nuts for them. Unfortunately, kind of hard to come by butterflies
Yeah,
in
yeah.
numbers that you are willing to feed out, but um, wide variety of diet. A lot of people do roaches. I do free feeding just because I have so many animals, but a lot of people will tongue feed. I've never tried it, but I wouldn't be surprised if they wouldn't take like a pinky or something. But they usually like that movement.
Mm.
So worms and stuff. Um, yeah, most similar insects that are pretty widely available in the hobby are usually what most people go to. Now in the
Yeah.
wild, they can eat kind of a crazy diet. They've been known to eat like scorpions and spiders.
Wow.
Is pretty sweet, to be honest. Seeing one of these take down a scorpion with just no fear, it's like, oh, okay, these are really cool.
That's where that powerful jaw comes into play.
Yeah,
So maybe you
exactly.
could dial back to you're just talking about starting to experiment maybe with the cohabbing, the male and females.
Yeah,
So
so
what's the data there?
yeah, so that was something I started this year, and it was actually uh, really successfully producing Abronia. I had always said, you know what, the best way to do it is to separate the male and female, less stress when a female is um, ovulating after the eggs have hopefully been fertilized or the ova. Um, and then give her that time where she can go and bask and eat and no competition is got to be more successful for development with babies. However, it's pretty hard to tell when a female is gravid because typically they'll breed in the kind of fall or the rainy season, which is what most of us in the States know as fall. In Mexico and Guatemala, that's their highest peak season for rain. They'll usually breed then, and then they kind of go dormant in winter where the temps really drop. You're talking down into in the cloud forest, they can get down into the 30s and 40s. They hunker down in
Wow.
a tree hollow, but they can handle some pretty cold temperatures. And then what they do is usually once the cold persists and the dry season goes away, as food availability starts coming up, they'll start coming out basking more, and that's when they're depositing those babies out. And then the babies have the best chance for survival. So they kind of almost go through this diapause state, at least is what I theorize, where they're breeding, going into that diapause state, and then the development starts happening. The tricky part is there's a really good paper discussing, I believe it was Abronia tanniata, and the captive or the wild cycling of males and females. And there's basically this window of when males are cycling properly and trying to breed with females. Starts usually in, I want to say it was like June or so, and goes well into September, October. But there is definitely a peak around that August time. And then females often will come into that reproductive state later than males, and often will start in that kind of August time and then go sometimes into October, November. Now, this is all conditionally and seasonally based in the wild, but to try and mimic that in captivity is what we really started trying to do. So, pairing animals up around August when both of them should be cycling was what we did last year. Now, we didn't see as much success as we wanted to. We've seen a litter of Graminia and then a litter of Arita, which was really small. She did have some slugs. Another cool fact is females will actually eat their slugs.
Wow.
A lot of times people may be getting slugs and not even know it. I've watched females consume them, and then I've also seen them pop out slugs and then come back the next day and they're gone. So they're really taking back in as many calories as they can. Um, but the hard thing is trying to make sure that cycling is matching up. So what we did this year is we actually did a litter survey. So basically, I was stalking Instagram, Facebook, anybody really that had Abronia that was posting it somewhere on social media. If somebody had a litter, I was hounding them of, hey, will you take this Abronia litter survey? And it probably tense. I literally thought about basically every single parameter that I could think of. It was like, here, I'm going to put this into a document and send it to you. Here's like 30 questions about what you did. It was a bit intense, and I'll probably scale it back for next year. But for those people that did respond back with answers, the data was actually really useful in the fact that we started to see some trends. We didn't get as much data as I would like to start to really say, okay, they have to go outside, or they have to be cohab together, or have to be separated. But we did start to see that more people than we originally thought were having success while cohabitating the animals together year round, and even the males being in with the females when they were actually birthing. So we've heard that males will eat the offspring.
Right.
I personally haven't seen it because I've always separated the males before that chance was even possible. But a lot of people still had major success and didn't see any predation from the male. Usually the females won't go after them, at least from the data that I've collected from myself and other people. But we started to see some really interesting aspects of people having a lot of success while keeping them together. And this may just be a factor of us trying to think we understand that they're cycling better than they understand their cycling.